We've just seen how Ranke's historical realism, while impressive, felt a bit, well, calm, like Goethe perhaps, knowing exactly what he could achieve. But then you have Michelet, all passion and turbulence, wrestling with history's big ideas, even if his conclusions sometimes felt a bit jarring. Now, let's turn our gaze to Tocqueville, another titan of French historiography, whose work also pulses with that same kind of inner turmoil. We're talking about a man wrestling not just with facts, but with himself, driven by empathy and a deep fear of loss. His journey takes us from a starkly tragic view of history towards a more weary, ironic acceptance. Whereas Michelet started with this grand romantic vision, kind of like a historical epic poem building up to 1789, only to end up in a more ironic, detached stance as reality fell short, Tocqueville starts us off already in the thick of it. He begins with a very specific, almost unbearably tragic sense of history. Think of it like starting a novel not at the beginning of a hero's quest, but right in the middle of their deepest despair. And over time, as events unfolded and the hoped for liberation seemed further away, his initial tragic intensity gradually fades into something colder, more resigned. It's this emotional arc, this shift from tragedy to irony that we want to trace. We're not just looking at his famous sociological insights or his political leanings here. We're digging into the style of his thinking, the very texture of his historical consciousness. And spoiler alert, despite his conservative leanings, his method actually points towards a radical understanding of social forces. This underlying tragic worldview is the bedrock of both his major works. So, what's the core problem Tocqueville sees? Forget neat resolutions or happy endings. For him, history isn't about finding synthesis or reconciliation. He looks at the big picture, the rise of democracy, the fall of aristocracy, and sees two fundamental, irreconcilable forces locked in eternal conflict. It's not just society versus society, it's man versus himself. He puts it beautifully, almost brutally. Man is perpetually standing on the edge of two abysses. On one side, the abyss of chaos, the raw, unformed state without which we couldn't even be called human beings. Think social order, civilization, culture. On the other side, the abyss within us, our base, demonic nature, the animal instincts that constantly pull us back down, preventing us from ever truly becoming fully human, fully angelic. Every time we try to reach for something higher, for the angelic spark within us, we're reminded of this precarious balance, this constant struggle against these internal and external voids. It's a deeply unsettling, fundamentally tragic condition. This sense of being caught between abysses means Tocqueville, like Balzac, finds a kind of awe in the mystery of history itself. Why is there history? Why this particular arrangement of things? It's an enigma. But unlike someone like Marx, who believed in discovering the deterministic laws governing everything, Tocqueville's view of man's inherent flaws and the primordial chaos he springs from prevents him from ever claiming complete knowledge. Being itself is a mystery, so how can we fully grasp the rules of the game? This stops him from reaching for a pure science of history, even though his typological approach seems to suggest it. Crucially, he doesn't buy into the pure ironist view that says history is ultimately meaningless. No, for him the meaning lies in this very eternal struggle, this contest with ourselves. Sometimes he sees it as a call to action, an Aeschylean push towards building a better future. Other times, it's a Sophoclean warning against hubris and premature judgment. This dual perspective is the heart of his liberalism. Only near the end does he almost succumb to pure, despairing irony, like Euripides or Shakespeare's later plays. But he fights it, suppressing it, because he believes it's morally wrong to spread such bleakness when people still need to strive, however imperfectly, to make a decent life. Okay, so how does Tocqueville actually do his history? He's all about creating types. Think of it like biology classifying species, but for societies. Democratic society, aristocratic society. These become his fundamental categories. He gathers data, observations, events, and slots them into these boxes. The magic happens when he arranges these types and explains how they interact. The big question driving his analysis is, what's the underlying process? How do these seemingly fixed types of society arise, clash, and evolve? Now, here's the twist. Tocqueville doesn't really give us a full answer to this question. Instead, Hefos focuses on describing the trends, the undeniable shift from aristocracy to democracy. And his view of this process is like a closed system. Imagine a seesaw. As one side rises, the other must fall. The energy isn't created or destroyed, just transferred. The rise of democratic power, in his view, necessarily comes at the expense of aristocratic power. It's a mechanical causal relationship, almost like clockwork, but with tragic consequences. Now, where does this growth lead? Not, as some idealists might hope, to a grand uplift in human consciousness. No, Tocqueville sees the real beneficiaries of this shift as the centralized state and the masses. And here's the kicker: he views their combined power as a critical threat, not just to old European traditions, but to civilization itself, maybe even to humanity's soul. This growth isn't a gentle evolution, it's a relentless erosion, wearing away at the intellectual, moral, and emotional fabric of society. It feels inevitable, like a tragic play unfolding. And what's the historian's job in all this? Early on, Tocqueville saw himself as a mediator, trying to bridge the gap between the crushing new forces and the fading ideals of the past. He lived in what he called a severed world, trying desperately to patch up the tears in its fabric, to find some way forward. Tocqueville uses America and France as test cases, potential futures for Europe. But he treats them differently. In Democracy in America, Volume 1, he's largely an outsider, looking at America with a kind of bemused, benign irony. He's writing for his fellow Europeans, showing them both the promise and the peril of this new democratic beast. Think of it as a report card on a student society. But in the old regime, the tone changes dramatically. He's more involved, more like a participant trapped in the process, desperately trying to understand its direction and warn people about the dangers. The mood is much darker, more tragic. The language shifts too, becoming more focused on process, on time flowing relentlessly forward. There's a clear shift from analyzing static structures to dynamic processes. Yet, despite these differences, both books ultimately paint a picture of stasis, frustration, and a sense of being trapped. This pervasive feeling of puzzled defeat fuels that ironic distance. What keeps Tocqueville from just giving up and embracing despair or rebellion? It's sheer willpower, allowing him to maintain a liberal stance, even when his historical analysis screams for something more radical or reactionary. Let's talk about dialectics. You know, that idea of opposing forces clashing and creating something new? Well, Tocqueville is pretty anti-dialectical. Where Ranke saw the tension between aristocratic and democratic forces as the very thing that allowed for compromise and progress, Tocqueville sees it as the main source of danger. His whole project is born from this anxiety. Can anything good survive this clash, or is total disaster the only outcome? This tension mirrors his view of human nature, the eternal struggle between the angel and the demon within us. Just as he sought a middle path in politics, avoiding the excesses of both emperors and saints, he sought a balanced view of history, one that acknowledged both forces without resolving them into a neat synthesis. It's a quest for equilibrium in a fundamentally unstable world. After Napoleon, Tocqueville felt Europe was stuck between the crumbling world of aristocracy and the uncertain dawn of democracy. It hadn't fully let go of the past, but it couldn't fully embrace the future either. The result? A messy hybrid, suffering from the worst of both worlds while missing out on the best. So, what's the historian's job here? To act as a judge, weighing the pros and cons of each system, looking ahead, and trying to guide Europe towards a choice that preserves freedom and creativity. But this requires a special kind of historical vision, one that isn't biased by aristocratic nostalgia or democratic enthusiasm. It needs to be objective, capable of seeing value in both, and salvaging useful elements from the wreckage of the past to build something better. This tension isn't just political, it's cultural too. Tocqueville saw his age swinging between the idealism of the old guard and the materialism of the new. The Enlightenment kicked aristocratic fancy to the curb, focusing minds on the tangible, the visible world. Initially, this meant a lot of focus on nature, the physical universe. But Tocqueville thought that was just a passing phase. The next stage, he predicted, would be a laser focus on man himself, especially the future of mankind. Democracies, he noted, are obsessed with what's coming next. Their imaginations run wild with possibilities. This materialistic, utilitarian turn definitely risks making the world less spiritual, but it also, paradoxically, breeds hope for the future. It's a trade-off. How does this shift affect art and poetry? Under aristocracy, poets had vast canvases, legends, myths, supernatural beings. But under democracy, Tocqueville argued, the scope shrinks. Legends fade, supernatural beings lose credibility. The poet turns inward, finding the universe within human nature itself. Man remains, he writes, and the poet needs no more. If we could somehow fuse the best of both worlds, the heroic spirit of idealism and the grounded realism of materialism, we could create a new cultural vision. This requires keeping alive both the despair and the aspiration born from that verge of two abysses. Art would evolve from epic to lyrical to tragic, philosophy from idealism to materialism to humanism, and the ideal society, a blend, democratic equality and material focus, mixed with aristocratic individualism and ideals. The historian's role, to show how both traditions stem from that fundamental human drive for freedom. Remember that early idea of the historian as mediator? That sets the stage for his eventual ironic outlook. Initially, he aimed for a tragic vision, believing history followed discoverable laws, much like Thucydides suggested. Finding these laws should, in theory, help us navigate the future with less suffering. But here's the catch. If you believe humans are fundamentally flawed, driven by irrational forces, then discovering these laws doesn't empower us. It reveals our chains. It shows not freedom but determinism. This belief in human imperfection is what ultimately stops Tocqueville from embracing radicalism, even though his quest for historical laws seemed to point that way. Instead, he suppresses the radical implications and pivots from searching for universal laws to constructing typologies. This shift in thinking is mirrored aesthetically. His narrative moves from a potentially tragic plot towards a more satirical, ironic tone. Later in life, he's constantly reflecting on how impossible it seems to truly win or escape the conditions we're born into. This deepening irony reinforces his liberal position. So, where does Tocqueville stand politically? His heart leans aristocratic, which makes him look like a conservative. But he's not your typical contented conservative. He's deeply dissatisfied with the present state of affairs. Think Gobineau, who lamented the decline from a golden age. But unlike Gobineau, Tocqueville refuses to declare his own time the absolute nadir. Like Croce later, he sees flaws in every historical era, every ideal system. This means he has to view both aristocracy and democracy through an ironic lens ultimately. He even avoids stating this ironic conclusion openly. He publicly maintains a tragic view, but his actions betray it. He won't spell out the historical laws he implies, nor will he draw the radical conclusions his own methods logically demand. It's a fascinating contradiction. Tocqueville explicitly compares history and poetry. Poetry seeks the ideal, the beautiful, the perfect. History, though, has to deal with the messy reality of human affairs, the real forces at play, the actual possibilities for the future. The problem? Neither a purely aristocratic nor a purely democratic approach to history captures the whole truth. The aristocratic historian zooms in on the big players, the great men shaping destiny, often missing the bigger, impersonal forces at work. The democratic historian, conversely, tends to dismiss individuals and focus everything on vast, abstract general causes, sometimes leading to a bleak view of human agency. Tocqueville calls these two modes formist focusing on individual forms and mechanistic focusing on general mechanisms. He sees both as limited, neither able to explain how societies actually evolve from one state to another. So, what's the solution? Not a third way, but a combination. Tocqueville suggests there's an elective affinity between the type of historical thinking and the society being studied. Aristocratic societies emphasize individual influence, democratic ones general causes. Both are valid, but each applies best to its own context. So, a democratic historian focusing on general causes isn't wrong, but shouldn't ignore individuals. An aristocratic historian focusing on individuals isn't wrong, but shouldn't ignore the bigger picture. But here's the snag. How do you use the displaced aristocracy's own perspective to explain why they lost power? That's like using the defeated side's playbook to analyze their defeat. Tocqueville's challenge is to translate between these two ways of seeing the world, to mediate between the metaphorical and metonymical views without losing the realism of either. His tool for this is irony, but he can't fully embrace a comic or reconciled view because the historical reality felt anything but harmonious. Tocqueville is wary of the democratic historian's obsession with general causes. Sure, it has its place, but relying solely on it is dangerous. Why? Because it can lead people to believe history is just happening involuntarily, that we're all puppets dancing to some hidden strings, whether divine or natural. Even if you think you've found the grand cause, it doesn't prove free will. He feared this deterministic view could paralyze society. So, his goal is to acknowledge general causes exist, but to limit their power. They work best in purely democratic societies, but in complex, mixed societies like Europe, you need to consider both general cultural forces and individual human actions. This tension between these two kinds of causality, both seen as legitimate, gives his earlier work that distinctly tragic feel. Ultimately, Tocqueville sees the historian's role as therapeutic, like Aeschylus's tragic poet. History should help us exercise outdated fears and prepare us to take responsibility for our own destiny, building institutions that cultivate our best selves. To do this, he argues, we need to salvage the aristocratic viewpoint, not as a blueprint for society, but as a necessary counterbalance to the potentially demoralizing effects of the purely democratic view of history. Can we combine these? He thinks so. Maybe even transcend both, merging history with poetry, the real with the ideal. This allows thought to elevate us, rather than just depressing us. When he wrote Democracy in America, he positioned himself as impartial, looking further than others, concerned with the whole future, not just the next day. This distinction lets him claim objectivity, a scientific approach, contrasting himself with more pragmatic, utilitarian historians. John Stuart Mill even pointed out the subtle anti-libertarian bias in this move. Crucially, Tocqueville wasn't a conservative stuck in the past. He genuinely believed a different future was possible. This places him firmly in the liberal camp. He avoids predicting the exact shape of that future, instead mapping out the possibilities stemming from the present and then emphasizing the crucial role of human choice in determining which path is taken. His use of history isn't about providing easy answers, but about grounding people in the reality of their choices, inspiring them to act, while warning them of the difficulties. It's a constant oscillation, celebrating human potential, acknowledging the risks and costs, and returning to the importance of struggle and effort. This blend of optimism about choice and awareness of hardship is what makes him both a classic liberal and a profound, tragic realist. So Tocqueville's mission is to mediate across divides, between aristocracy and democracy, past and present, present and future. He presents various options: tyranny by the elite, tyranny by the mob, and tries to articulate the tragic nature of history to encourage a balanced mix of seriousness and hope. He believed democracy was inevitable for Europe, but how people lived within that democracy was still up for grabs. His initial impulse was dialectical, searching for a synthesis. But his analytical method, his typological approach, actually worked against synthesis. By breaking things down into irreconcilable types, aristocracy versus democracy, individual versus general causes, he made the possibility of uniting them seem increasingly remote. His focus on process and parts led him to perceive the impossibility of a grand unifying whole. Looking at democracy in America, it's less a traditional history book and more an anatomy of a phenomenon. The timeline is assumed, the evolution isn't the main point. What matters is the analysis of the current state, seen as a kind of monstrous culmination of democratic tendencies, stripped of checks and balances. Tocqueville wrote with a kind of awe, almost reverence, for this unstoppable democratic revolution sweeping across America. It felt providential, universal, inevitable. Europe had witnessed its impact, destroyed its old aristocracy, but now hesitated, reluctant to fully embrace the new world it had helped create. Tocqueville urged Europe not to linger on the ruins of the past, but to face the future, acknowledging that trying to rebuild the old aristocratic order was futile. The task was to forge liberty from within the democratic condition. But Tocqueville wasn't blindly optimistic about democracy. He saw immense dangers lurking within the principle of equality, dangers he called the most formidable and least foreseen. However, he hoped these weren't insurmountable. Democratic societies, he argued, would naturally generate certain traits: impatience with rules, a love of power, a tendency to hate those in charge, that would actually prevent tyranny and provide ammunition for future fights for liberty. The key, he insisted, was perspective. Don't judge the new age by the standards of the old. They're fundamentally different. People of the new age have their own virtues and vices. He rejected both extremes, abandoning freedom out of fear and despairing of it out of pessimism. His final plea? Look ahead, yes, but with salutary fear, the kind that keeps you vigilant and watchful for freedom, not faint in idle terror that just makes you give up. So what was Tocqueville's ultimate subject? Not just American democracy, but the enduring ideal of freedom itself, something both aristocracy and democracy touched upon. Yet America, in his eyes, was a kind of monstrosity, a distorted reflection, a schism in Western civilization. It was a hothouse where the democratic impulse, freed from European constraints, bloomed into a pure, perhaps extreme, form. Europe, burdened by its past, had the chance to learn from America's example and create something wiser. By the time he wrote the second volume, he saw cracks in America too: stagnation, materialism, the risk of plutocracy. He argued nothing was truly American. It all came from Europe. And Europe's advantage? Its history of conflict forced a fusion of democratic ideals with revolutionary energy, creating a potential for ongoing renewal that America lacked. Tocqueville's work, then, is this intricate dance between analyzing types, recognizing tragedy, and ultimately appealing for a balanced, vigilant, and hopeful engagement with the future.